The Democrats got another official presidential candidate as Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware entered the race today. As with all other declared candidates, we have a newsmaker interview with the senator. It follows this short profile.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to restore America's soul. It's time to be on the march again. It's time to get America moving again. Come join me and let's move it.
At 44, Democrat Joseph Biden, the third-term senator from Delaware, is the youngest candidate to enter the race for the presidency. Described by many as his party's best orator, Biden frequently evokes the memory of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy.
Just because they murdered our heroes does not mean that the dream does not still live buried deep in the broken hearts of tens of millions of Americans.
Joseph Biden Jr. was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and later moved to Wilmington, Delaware, where his father managed a Chevrolet dealership. He grew up in a traditional Irish Catholic family. He attended the University of Delaware and Syracuse University Law School, from which he graduated in 1968. Biden then went back to Wilmington to work as a trial lawyer. He entered politics in 1970 as a member of the Newcastle County Council. In 1972, Biden challenged the popular incumbent Senator Caleb Boggs and won by a narrow majority. At 29, he became second youngest person ever elected to the U.S. Senate. A month after his election, Biden's wife and baby daughter were killed and his two sons injured in an auto accident. He took the oath in his son's hospital room, but considered giving up his newly won seat to spend more time with his family. Biden still commutes home to Wilmington every day by Amtrak. In 1977, he married the former Jill Jacobs, a school teacher. Besides his two sons, Hunt, now 17, and Beau, 18, they have a daughter, Ashley, who is 8. Senator Biden was re-elected easily in 1978 and again in 84. He has gained visibility through his position as an outspoken Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. He has tangled with Reagan officials such as Secretary Shultz over issues like South Africa.
I'm ashamed that this country puts out a policy like this that says nothing. It says continue the same. We put no timetable on. We make no specific demand. We don't set it down. I'm ashamed that's our policy. That's what I'm ashamed of. I'm ashamed of the lack of moral backbone to this policy.
Well, I resent that deeply because there is tremendous moral backbone in that policy.
Biden has also been in the spotlight on the Judiciary Committee, first as a member, now as chairman. He's been a vocal opponent of Reagan judicial nominees such as Daniel Mannion.
Have they said anything beyond the fact he's a fine man?
Thus far, Biden has been the most successful of all Democratic candidates in raising funds. As of mid-April, he had raised $1.73 million. Coming from a small state such as Delaware, Biden's challenge is now to get himself better known throughout the country, particularly in New Hampshire and Iowa, where he's been campaigning. Today, Biden made his candidacy official in his hometown of Wilmington. Then it was on to Washington and Des Moines. I spoke to Senator Biden about his run for the presidency earlier today. Senator, you considered running 4 years ago, in 1984. Everything's obviously going to be different in 1988. President Reagan is not going to be a candidate, for one thing. How are you different 4 years later?
Well, I'm different in that my family is more ready. My family's 4 years older. My daughter is 6 now and able to travel with me some. My son, Beau, is going into college next year. My other son's going to be a senior. Very different than having them in their early teens, in my view, and much easier on a family. And secondly, the Democratic Party is much different. Back in '84, there was still a very, very serious debate about whether or not the party had to change from its sort of old New Deal image to a different view of ourselves and our view of the country. And thirdly, there is a change in me. There's 4 more years' experience. I feel more confident about the issues, more confident about my abilities than I did 4 years ago. And for all of those reasons and others, 19 1988 is a lot different than it was in 1984.
You mentioned the family. Is the family equation going to be different in this election? It seems to be so much more talk about character and a man's personal background, and especially since the Gary Hart episode. Is that going to make the politics of '88 a great deal more personally intrusive?
Robin, I didn't think so at first, but quite frankly, I'm beginning to think it will make it much more intrusive. And how that's going to play out, I quite frankly don't know. I'm not being facetious when I say this. I expect you know the answer to that much better than I do, because you know the press much better than I do. But it is already different than it was 10 months ago when I started to consider running in 1988.
Mm-hmm. Is that daunting to you at all?
Well, quite frankly, it is. Not in the sense, obviously this is a defensive answer, but not in the sense that I worry about any skeletons in my background or whether or not my family can take it. But we have been both a close family and a very private family. And our love and affection for one another are like that of most American families, that we want to be able to be as demonstrable with one another as we have in the past. On the other hand, we don't want to turn it into either an asset or those saying that, well, gee, look, Joe Biden, the family man who goes home every night, is a good guy, and then someone else saying, well, what, is Biden only running on being a family man? I mean, it seems to cloud the issue. I wish we were not in the position in 1987 going into '88 of family and fidelity, two things I feel strongly about, being an essential ingredient as to whether or not someone should or should not be a nominee, but it looks like it's going that way.
There is an awfully big field this year, at least to start with, in the Democratic Party. A lot of candidates out there, like you, saying we've got to change things. Why should voters single you out? What is there about you, Joe Biden, that, if you can, I invite you to be modest about yourself for a moment, why should they single you out?
Well, obviously, what campaigns are all about is to determine whether or not what I'm about to say is true and whether or not the American people are comfortable with Joe Biden as this campaign moves on. But I think the distinguishing feature of my candidacy, or one of the features, is that I have a considerable amount of experience after 14 and a half years in the United States Senate at dealing with subjects that are of significant concern to whomever the next president will be, particularly in the area of foreign policy. I'm the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. I've chaired NATO's Committee on Nuclear Planning. I've met with world leaders over the last 10 to 12 years. And secondly, I think that my view of what the role of the next president must be. See, I think the next president is going to preside over a watershed period in this country's history where we're going to make in a very short time frame some very important decisions that are going to bind us well into the next century. Obvious case in point will be whether or not we move forward and nuclearize the heavens, or whether we have the most significant arms control agreement in history. The same can be said with regard to our trade policy, with regard to our education policy. We're at the similar point that we were at the end of World War II, where we're going to put in motion a series of policies and initiatives that bind us for a long time to come. And I think that the next president has to not only have a clear sense of what he or she wishes those policies to be, but has to understand that his role is not merely to preside over the government, but to go out and lead society, because ultimately society is going to have to change its attitudes about excellence, about competition, about who we are as a country and what our obligations are to one another. And that comes from inside the American people, but it has to be led by a president who is going to say, come on, a little bit of idealism is an important ingredient here to make this country work again.
One of the things that is said about you, for example, by William Schneider in the Atlantic Monthly, he says this: the question, is Joe Biden substantive enough, is, as Biden himself acknowledges, his potential Achilles heel. Do you acknowledge that? Is it a potential Achilles heel? Are you struggling to overcome an impression that you are not substantive enough?
I am now, because I've been given more credit than I deserve in terms of my ability to speak. I think the flip side of that is, as Mario Cuomo was saying to me a couple weeks ago, the flip side of being viewed as a good speaker or an orator is that if you're an orator, you obviously can't be substantive. Well, I'm neither an orator nor do I lack substance. And I think, quite frankly, Robin, that's why I'm anxious for this campaign to get underway. I think after the first several debates, after you all have, now that I'm a declared candidate, after you all have gone in great detail and looked at my legislative record and my accomplishments, or lack thereof from your perspective, you and the American people will begin to make a sound and informed judgment about whether or not I am substantive. I am confident that, not that I have all the answers, but that I am a substantive person with a almost 15-year record in the United States Senate that I am prepared and anxious to have examined. And I think by the time the campaign is underway, some months, that will no longer be an issue with regard to me. But right now, I acknowledge it is. They say he's a great speaker, but can he dance too?
Reading your speeches recently, it seems, at least it appears, that what you may be trying to do is to generate a mood at the moment, and particularly generate a mood in particular in the baby boomer generation, the people who became politically aware like yourself in the 1960s. Is that what you were trying to do?
Quite frankly, yes. And the reason I am is twofold. If I can be somewhat anecdotal for a moment, about 10 months ago, we put together a major economic conference at my home, laying out all the issues I wanted to go in depth about. And we invited 14 of the nation's leading economists, from Robert Reich to Paula Stern to Larry Shimeron to Blinder, a whole range of people, all of whom accepted and came. And we went through this two-day conference in great detail about what our trade policy should be, our monetary policy, et cetera. And when I got all finished, I said, now, if we do all the things you've just suggested, will that increase productivity in America? And everybody sort of shuffled and put their heads down. And finally, one spoke up and said, well, no, it won't. And they said, I said, well, why? I didn't know what answer I really expected. And they said, we are not going to become more productive. We are not going to be the leading economic engine in the world in the year 2000 unless we change. And the way we have to change is we have to learn more than other countries are learning. Their students are learning more than ours. They're smarter than we are. They're making better products, and on down the line. And that said to me something very simple. In addition to us having the right legislative initiatives and blueprints, the American people have to understand that we have to change. And the essence of that change has to come from my generation, because they are now the bulk of the workforce. I am not a baby boomer technically. I'm 44 years old. I was born during the war, not after. And there is a cynicism on the part of many about what my generation is about. And I am literally resting my candidacy on the proposition that it is my generation is equally as committed and equally as ready to dedicate itself to excellence as my parents' generation.
You haven't ignored the fact in your calculation that that age group, is going to be 60% of the electorate in 1988.
Don't get me. I didn't mean to sound so non-political about it. Obviously, if I cannot convince that generation that they have to care about my children and their children, that they have to have a sense of idealism, that they have to do for we have to do for our children what our parents did for us. If I can't rekindle a sense of idealism in them, then this country can't move, and I, in fact, should not be president of the United States of America. But the pure mathematical calculation is they do hold the balance of almost 60%, as you point out, in the upcoming election. They must be energized.
You say quite often in your most common speech, the cynics believe my generation, having reached the conservative age of mortgage payments, pediatricians' bills, and saving for our children's educations, are ripe for Republican picking. Why are the cynics wrong?
Because our party has not attempted to appeal to their sense of idealism. We sort of left them behind, and in fact, the last several times they did vote Republican. But unless my party can go in and reach in and remind them of their responsibility, bring them back. See, I think that generation of Americans, if you listen to their music, if you look at their culture, if you look at what they say about themselves, I think they want to be involved. It's not a naivete. It's not this notion that we're going to make the world free of hunger and despair, but that we, my generation, can make things better, as my mother's generation made it better for us. I think they want to be involved in a way that they haven't been asked to be involved in the past. And when given the option of having the old Democratic answers which they've lost faith in, or the Republican anthem which says the last 8 years has said, go take care of yourself, they've said, well, given those two options, one that doesn't work and the other that'll take care of me, I'll take care of me. But given the option that taking care of yourself also means you have to take care of other people, or this sort of creed of greed that the Reagan administration has been spreading, I'm convinced they'll pick the former, not the latter.
Well, Senator Biden, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Now to the controversy that has suddenly erupted around the Democratic presidential candidate Joseph Biden, the charge that he has plagiarized parts of his speeches. Today, Biden was forced to take time out from his Judiciary Committee duties to hold a press conference to answer two charges: that he copied part of a paper when in law school, and recently adopted as his own quotations from the Kennedys and other politicians. The story surfaced last weekend when the New York Times compared a Biden conclusion in a debate in Iowa to a well-received speech delivered last year by British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock. First Kinnock, then Biden.
Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Was it because all our predecessors were thick? Did they lack talent? Those people who could sing and play and recite and write poetry? Those people who could make wonderful, beautiful things with their hands? Those people who could dream dreams, see visions? But why didn't they get it? Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak? Those women who could survive 11 childbearings? Were they weak? Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
And I started thinking as I was coming over here, why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university? Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college? Is it because our fathers and mothers were not bright? Is it because I'm the first Biden in 1,000 generations to get a college and a graduate degree that I was smarter than the rest? Those same people who read poetry and wrote poetry and taught me how to sing verse? Is it because they didn't work hard? My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania and come up after 12 hours and play football for 4 hours? No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
Today, Biden moved to confront the controversy that faces his presidential campaign. Jeff Goldman reports.
Reporters packed a Capitol Hill news conference to hear Senator Biden's response to the plagiarism allegations. He was asked if he indeed studied the Kinnock videotape.
The answer is yes. I looked at that tape. I was moved by that tape. We sat down, I turned it on, I said, my Lord, look at this guy. Look at what he is expressing here. And I looked at it once and I didn't have to look at it again. And what I would do out on the stump, I'd say, I saw a tape from Neil Kinnock where he stands there and he's angry. And he looks out at his people and he says, why am I the first Kinnock ever to go to a university? It doesn't take much if you feel that, folks. You don't have to look at that 10 times. I saw that and it was a connect. I mean, I could tell how that man felt. And it's how I feel. It's how I feel about what my party's about and what I'm about.
Biden also defended his use of unattributed quotations in his campaign speeches.
The fact of the matter is, every time that I have been aware that it has been someone else's quote, I have used it. As a matter of fact, the criticism of me by the press, with good reason, has been in part in this campaign that I quote too many people, that I quote Kennedy all the time, I quote King all the time, I quote Humphrey all the time. So what I'm saying to you is that if and when I've ever quoted anyone without saying this is their quote, it's either because, as I say in some speeches, listen, can you hear the voices? Let the word go forth. I don't quote anybody, everybody knows that. When I haven't attributed, it's either because, in fact, it's been clearly known by everyone what it is, or I honestly did not know I was quoting somebody else.
A third charge leveled against Biden alleged that as a first-year law student at Syracuse University, he plagiarized a law review article in a legal brief prepared for class.
I took the cases out of the law review article and the footnotes out of the law review article, and I thought what I was doing honestly was the right way to do it, and the representation about what the case said from the law review article. And then at the end of the law review article, when they set out and said, this is what all this means, I wrote that in my paper, what the conclusion of the law review article, and I footnoted it. Now, folks, the footnote, I'm footnoting a law review article in a 15-page paper where I use 5 pages of the 15 pages out of the law review, which refer to the cases. And then as the conclusion comes up, I cite the conclusion, footnote 21, law review article, what page it occurs at the end of this citation. I was wrong, but I was not malevolent in any way. And so this young fella, who apparently somebody's found, some other campaign's found, great, I knew he'll already be around somewhere one day, found, and he went as a good young fella, and he said, hey, professor, this guy didn't do it the right way. Brought it to the professor brought it to the dean said, explain yourself, Biden. And I wrote, which you will get, it's in my record here, I wrote a 2-page letter explaining why I had been so stupid, but that I did not intentionally move to mislead anybody. I didn't.
Biden was then asked what effect these allegations would have on his presidential campaign.
I don't think it will have any effect, but I don't know. You all will make the judgment about that. It'll all depend on how you write it. I don't mean that. I'm not being smart. It'll all depend on the American people looking at me. They're going to look at me and say, is Joe Biden being honest with me? Or is Joe Biden not being honest with me? I'm being honest.
Back in his place as chairman of the televised Bork confirmation hearings, Biden got some morale boosting from Republican Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming.
Our chairman has been ultimately fair, not only in these hearings, but in everything I have done with him in my 9 years in the United States Senate. Very able, very candid, very accommodating, very helpful, very courteous to me as a member of the majority or the minority. I don't know where all this stuff will go with regard to your present situation. Hang on tight. You have at least had the guts to throw yourself in the public arena to run for the presidency, and that's better than a lot of faint-hearted detractors will ever do in this world. And they will be the ones who will be trying to sully you and pull you down. And so more power to you as you grapple with that one.
Thank you, Senator.
With us now to discuss the impact of all this on the Biden presidential campaign is Howard Fineman, the chief political correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Howard, do you think Biden's put this to rest with his news conference?
Not entirely, Robin. I think Alan Simpson's advice to hang on tight is probably advice that Joe Biden should heed. I think on the positive side for him, no one has ever looked at campaign speeches as holy writ. I mean, the famous John F. Kennedy statement about ask what your country can do for you, it turns out, goes back at least as far as Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I think also that as far as his Syracuse Law School experience is concerned, at the time he was 23 years old, and I think that stands him in good stead. Also, I think in a funny way, the timing of the coincidence of this with the Bork hearing is a benefit politically in the sense that Democrats especially don't want to see their chairman chewed up at a time when they're trying to defeat Bob Bork. That's the good news. I think the bad news is that in another sense, the timing couldn't have been worse. This was going to be Joe Biden's season in the sun. Now that season is being clouded over by these charges. I think that he has tried to sell himself as the boy orator, the passionate boy orator of the Democratic Party, and if it turns out that a lot of his rhetoric comes from somewhere else, that calls into question the depth of his commitment. And also there's been talk over the months about how influenced he may be by his very high-powered group of advisors, and if they're slipping him passages to read under the door, that calls into question his basic honesty, I think.
Let's go through some of those points. First of all, campaign oratory. How different from the borrowing that other politicians all do, some with attribution, some not, is Biden's practice?
Well, I think it's a matter of degree if it's controversial, and quite frankly, it is right now. As many campaigners say, as campaign speechwriters have been telling us all day, and other candidates, there's kind of a collective fund of rhetoric, especially that the Democrats draw on by virtue of their love of the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and the Kennedys and so forth. But I think what got Biden in trouble, at least this is the view of some other Democrats, is that he would preface his remarks by saying, gee, as I was coming over here tonight, it suddenly occurred to me that, and then continue on with his statement. I think if he hadn't said that in Iowa and he hadn't said that in a couple of other places, the fact that he hadn't directly attributed some of these remarks, I think, would be rather less controversial.
There was another little bit at the press conference today which we didn't have time to include in the excerpt we just showed, where he explained that he had prepared all his stuff as much as he could for that debate in Iowa, but he didn't have an ending, as he put it. And then an aide said, well, what about that Neil Kinnock bit that you've been using? And he said, oh, yeah, that's good. And then he delivered it as we saw him deliver it.
Well, I think that's exactly what happened. I talked to the other fellow in the van today who was part of that. He confirms that story. I think that's probably precisely what happened. And in fairness to Biden, at other stops in Iowa in the preceding weeks, he had used that same thing and attributed it to Kinnock.
Well, is that what is the order of that kind of political crime, to have used it before and attributed it and then slipped it in and said, as I just thought coming over here? I mean, where does that weigh in the scale of crimes that would damage a candidate?
It's somewhere between a peccadillo and a minor misdemeanor, I think, except for the fact that if there's a pattern that can be showed, and there do seem to be some other examples of it, and if you're offering as your calling card to Democratic voters the depth of your commitment, your passion, and your skill as an orator, then I think you set yourself up for close scrutiny of what you say and where that comes from. That's why I think it's an issue with Joe Biden. If Mike Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts, had done some of this, perhaps people might say he was trying to brighten up his image as an orator. Well, this is what Biden's supposed to be best at, and that raises the question of where it comes from.
Well, let's look at where this comes from, at least where the charges have surfaced from at this particular time. Right. This evening, the Iowa Democratic chairwoman, Bonnie Campbell, wondering about the timing, said, I'm not prone to paranoia, but I have to wonder if we do not have a Republican dirty trickster about. I don't think it's an accident this happened at this time. Now, I know there is a lot of rumor going around. What do you know about that, and what can you tell us?
Well, what I can tell you, Robert, is that there are a lot of rumors floating around, but no hard evidence that anybody in the Biden campaign, at least, is willing to put on the record at this time. I've had people who work for other campaigns tell me that they were in another country at the time, and they can show me the phone bills to prove that they never called Washington in the last couple of weeks. I think if there is a consensus of the rumors, if it's possible to have such a thing, at this point, attention focuses on Democratic rivals as far as the speeches are concerned, and on Republicans as far as the Syracuse Law School thing is concerned. I find both of those things to be somewhat questionable for the following reasons. Many copies of the tape of the Kinnock speech were floating around Washington over the last couple of months. There wasn't just one hot copy. There were lots of copies in a lot of places.
And other Democratic candidates were shown it, too, I
Yes,
believe, yeah.
Most of them, all of them received copies of it, as I understand it. Now, as far as the Syracuse Law School incident is concerned, there were 109 other members of Joe Biden's freshman class at Syracuse Law School that year, And the incident that he was involved in was very well known to most of the other people in the class because, in fact, Biden was kind of made an example of by the faculty up there. And I think any one of those other people could have tipped somebody off about it. And I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist on this matter.
Yeah. Well, in brief, Howard, can Biden's presidential campaign survive this, or is this a kind of Gary Hart kind of incident?
Well, it's not like Gary Hart for several reasons. One of them is that Joe Biden is not the lofty frontrunner that Gary Hart was. I mean, he's way down at the bottom of the polls as it is, so he didn't have very far to fall. I think it's a missed opportunity for him to raise himself up in a positive way, but I'm not prepared to bury him just yet. It's still too long before the primaries.
Howard Fineman, thank you for joining us.
The going of Senator Joe Biden is the lead story of this day. He stood down as a 1988 candidate for president, ending 12 days of snowballing embarrassment for the Delaware Democrat. First, over the revelation that he used without attribution the words of American political figures Hubert Humphrey and Robert Kennedy and British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock. Then that he also had plagiarized material for a law school paper 20 years earlier, that he lied about where he ranked in law school and about scholarships and awards he won in undergraduate school. He stopped that story and his presidential candidacy with a statement at a Washington news conference this afternoon. Here's an extended excerpt from it.
I made some mistakes, but now the exaggerated shadow of those mistakes has begun to obscure the essence of my candidacy and the essence of Joe Biden. And folks, I see my good friend Fritz Hollings over there. I've been here long enough to know that when the tide starts to roll, when things start to move, when things like this begin to happen, it requires all of one's time, energy, and concentration to put it back on track. And it would require all of my time, my commitment in the weeks ahead. And then who knows? Maybe I would or would not be able to put it back on track. At the same time, somewhat coincidentally, at the same time, all of my energy and skill is required to deal with President Reagan's effort to reshape the Supreme Court in a way that I truly believe will be harmful for this country. And therefore, it seems to me I have a choice. I have to choose between running for president and doing my job to keep the Supreme Court from moving in a direction that I believe to be truly harmful. There will be other opportunities for me to campaign for president, but there will not be many other opportunities for me to influence President Reagan's choice on the Supreme Court. And although it's awfully clear to me what choice I have to make, I have to tell you honestly, I do it with incredible reluctance, and it makes me angry. I'm angry with myself for having been put myself in the position of having to make this choice. And I am no less frustrated with the environment of presidential politics that makes it so difficult to let the American people measure the whole Joe Biden and not just misstatements that I have made. But folks, be that as it may, I've concluded that I will stop being a candidate for President of the United States. I learned several other things from this whole experience. I learned that notwithstanding our political differences in this body, that honor and integrity, treating people honorably and acting with integrity count for a whole lot, even with your political opponents. Not a single public official who announced for me has withdrawn their support. And my colleagues in both political parties needed no explanation of my conduct before they immediately stood up and vouched for my honor, my integrity, and my credibility. And those who taught me in school, law school, those who went to school with me, law school, high school, and grade school, all the same exact thing, notwithstanding the fact I was not the valedictorian. And I want to tell you and tell them that means more to me than they will ever know. I also want to thank those who
have given so much of themselves to try to get me nominated this time. Those who helped me raise money, those who organized Iowa, New Hampshire, and other parts of the country, and those who have done everything from lick envelopes to travel thousands of miles on my behalf. And most of all, I want to thank my Delaware for standing with me. You know, this presidential politics, one of you press folks asked me, he said, Biden, what's going to happen when the white-hot heat turns on? You warned me what it was going to be like. I thought I knew. It's a tough arena, but I'm a big boy. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But now it's time for me to do just what I would have done had I not won in Iowa, and just what I would have done had I lost on the convention floor. It's time for me to assess my mistakes and make sure that I don't make them again. It's time for me to remind myself of why I got involved in politics in the first place. Because I believed, as I do now, that I can make a little bit of a difference. To use a Biden phrase that others seem to use these days, that I can bend history just a little bit. I still believe that. And for me, the next battle has already been engaged. For me, there's no doubt that the appointment of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court would profoundly affect our future. I intend to be deeply involved in that battle. I intend to attempt to bring it to victory. And let me tell you folks one other thing. I still believe it's time to rekindle the spirit of idealism in this country. I think it's time for the world once again to look at America and be proud of what we stand for. I think it's time for the Democratic Party to demonstrate to the American people that we have that sense of idealism and we're not ashamed of it. And I think the Democratic Party will do that in 1988. But for me, the effort now shifts. First of all, to the Judiciary Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee, and the great debates on the floor of the United States Senate. There will be other presidential campaigns, and I'll be there, Oliphant. I'll be there. There will be other opportunities. There will be other battles in other places, other times. And I'll be there. And I'll be there seeking to share with all Americans and those who will stand with me the promise proclaimed in the communion hymn you heard me recite all across this country. And he will lift you up on eagle's wings and bear you on the breath of dawn and make the sun to shine on you. This country is going to be lifted up, and I'm going to play a big part in doing it. But for now, folks, got to go handle the Bork hearings. I have no questions. I appreciate your consideration. I appreciate you being here. And lest I say something that might be somewhat sarcastic, I should go to the Bork hearings. Thanks, folks. My wife and I thank you very much. And Tommy, thanks for being here. Thanks. Folks. See you all later.
We get an inside perspective first on the Biden decision to quit. It comes from Boston media consultant John Martilla. He is a close personal friend and has been a senior political consultant to Joe Biden in his past Senate campaigns as well as the presidential campaign that ended today. Mr. Martilla, was this a difficult decision or did events kind of make it for him?
Oh, sure, it was a very difficult decision. And I think Senator Biden and many of his advisors were deeply conflicted about getting out of the race. I think all of us were anxious to take this entire case to the American people. But I think ultimately what happened was that he did not feel it was possible to run for president, to manage the Bork nomination hearings, and deal with this crisis. Several months ago, when the Supreme Court vacancy became a reality, there was a long, careful discussion about the impact of that development as it affected Joe's campaign, and there was a clear, considered decision that the presidential campaign had to take a back seat to the hearings, and that's the way the hearings have been conducted. During the past 45 days or so, I think Joe has done less campaigning than any other candidate by a long shot.
Yes, but the decision to withdraw related, of course, to the revelations of
Sure.
the last 12 days. When did he make the decision to quit?
Late last night. I would think that I spoke with him by phone, I think around midnight, and I would say sometime thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of argument about it? Is that what when you say conflicted, or was when it finally
No,
came
I don't
down
think so.
to
I think
it?
no, people were torn. Torn's a better word, not conflicted.
I see.
And I think that, as I said, I was not in Delaware last night, but I know what happened. Joe came home. He spent 2 or 3 hours with his family, and I think talked through the decision. I'm quite convinced he probably came to a determination as a result of meeting with his family, and then afterwards he met with some of the key staff people.
Now, you know Joe Biden very well. What is there about him that caused him to plagiarize other people's material and to distort what his personal record was in schools, et cetera, that caused this problem?
Well, you know, let me answer your question with a question, because I think the issue that we've been debating for the past 10 days is whether these 10 minutes of campaign activity, the Kinnock tape and the speeches and so forth, are really a fair representation of what his candidacy stood for, what his Senate record stood for, and whether they're a fair reflection of what this campaign was all about. Obviously, we don't believe they were. I mean, I think that the campaign was conducted with great honor, with great enthusiasm. We had wonderful organizations in Iowa and New Hampshire, throughout the country, great fundraising capacity, and I think that these events, which were real and which Joe said on the tape, which were mistakes, to me it's a very troubling issue when events which are real, but nevertheless I think not all that significant in the total evaluation and measurement of Joe Biden as a human being.
You used the word honor. Are you saying that it is not dishonorable to use other people's words the way he did and not attribute them?
Let me give you one example, not to rearrange what has taken place, but let's deal with the Bobby Kennedy quote. Joe gave a speech in California, the California Democratic Convention. It was a 40-minute speech, 45-minute speech, pure Biden speech, a long speech. As you may be aware, he writes most of his material, and he takes great pride in writing that. He flew across to California the night before, still working on the speech. There was a fairly celebrated incident which took place the following morning. The speech was supposed to be typed, and the typist never showed up. And so Joe went on to the convention floor with, it wasn't on the back of an envelope, but it was the functional equivalent in modern times, and gave a speech which was literally pieced together over the past 2 or 3 days in terms of his own personal participation. I spoke with him last week. I'd seen the speech. I read the speech a couple times. I saw the tape several times. I didn't know it was a Bobby Kennedy quote, and I'm a fan of Bobby Kennedy. I guess I should have known. I didn't know. He just didn't know. And I think that
Joe Biden did not know.
Did not know.
Did he know about that it was a Neil Kinnock speech?
Oh, sure he did. I think he did. And I think the Newsweek account of what happened, I think, is precisely accurate. David Wilhelm can talk about this in a few seconds. But he, on previous occasions, he had attributed the Kinnock quote. And David and Senator Biden were driving through Iowa on the way to the debate. And David was the one who suggested to Joe that, why don't you kind of retell the Kinnock tale? In the previous treatment of this, the Kinnock tape, Joe attributed Kinnock's involvement and how the tape came about and all the rest of this thing freely. So, and again, my question is that he must have spoken about Kinnock in the past month and a half, I don't know, 25, 30 times. And he failed to attribute it on 2 or 3 occasions. Most regrettably, it was on Iowa television. I don't know if we can draw such widespread...
Well, what it really gets down to, I think, finally, let me ask you this. When Gary Hart withdrew, people sat around this table and other tables and said, well, Gary Hart was always an accident or a disaster ready to happen because of various flaws in his character, et cetera. Does Joe Biden and what happened today fit into that same category?
As a 15-year friend, of course, I don't believe that's the case. And I think that my judgment is borne out by the testimony, unsolicited testimony, he received from his Senate colleagues, Democratic and Republican, on the Judiciary Committee, throughout the Senate, There was our national organization, which consisted of many elected officials throughout America, was completely steadfast. Nobody moved. People, I would say, by and large, if I were to characterize the mood of our national organization, it was they wanted Joe to stay in this election. And let me clarify one thing, because I don't want to have the point I just made about the Kinnock tape misunderstood. Joe didn't attribute Kinnock in the Iowa debate, which was on television. But previously, when he had presented this material in Iowa, it had been in the presence of other reporters, and many reporters had heard him do it. So it was not a question of, and television, I think television cameras are, I don't know that for certainty. And presidential campaigns are enormous ordeals for the people who are involved in them. And I think not to make excuses, because this, I think, is a fair test of a candidate who goes through this ordeal. I think he was carrying the extra weight of the Bork hearings. I think that possibly that could account for why he didn't attribute it that particular night. It's a regrettable mistake. He apologized for it. To me, I guess the question is perspective.
All right.
If he properly dealt with this issue 95% of the time, did the 2 or 3 times he didn't, is that a...
Well, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back to you in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Charlene?
Our next view of the Biden pullout comes from a key campaign aide. He is David Wilhelm, Biden's campaign manager in Iowa. Mr. Wilhelm, how difficult is this pullout for you and the people in the Iowa campaign?
Well, we've had better weeks, but nobody's hanging their head. We're proud to have worked for Joe Biden. His campaign, his message was important to all of us. He talked about a return to idealism, getting this country moving again, and that attracted a lot of people, a lot of support. That's why I'm here. That's why more than 30 people have been on our staff working for next to nothing. And we're not hanging our heads, and we're ready to move on to the next battle.
Were you surprised? I mean, you just heard Mr. Mortilla talk about when the decision was made. Were you consulted, and when did you find out?
Well, we found out this morning, and we were consulted. Frankly, my opinion was if Joe Biden could come out to Iowa and make his case and state his point of view directly to the people of Iowa, we could have turned this thing around. People in Iowa know Joe Biden perhaps better than people in the rest of the country know him, and he has a huge reservoir of goodwill to draw down on. I think that had he been able to come out here, state his case directly, I think Iowans who are slow to turn on you and are fair-minded people, I think would have rallied to his cause.
Well, what is that case? What is that case that he should have stated or could have stated in your view?
Well, I think he's stated it very clearly. He's made mistakes. He's been very forthright about that. He's been very honest about it. There's been no dissembling. There's been no excuses. He said, I did these things. I'm sorry. And I think Iowans understand that much of this is much ado about nothing. What they want to know about and what they want to hear about is where are we going after President Reagan? What is it that this country is all about?
Well, can you shed any further light on the Kinnock episode? Mr. Mortilla said that you were involved in that.
I was involved in it. As the campaign manager out here, I had heard Joe Biden use that quote a number of times. In every single instance, attributing that quote to Neil Kinnock at great length, talking about who Neil Kinnock was, is, what he stands for, what his family's like. And on our way over, we were practicing the closing to the state fair debate, and neither one of us liked the closing that had been prepared for him. So I suggested to Senator Biden, why don't we use the government as a platform theme, which is the Kinnock quote. And the reason for that is because Joe Biden represents middle-class dreams, hopes, fears, and that quote gets to the heart of that. So on the way over, we talked about it. He used it. He failed to attribute it. Big deal.
But of course, that wasn't the only thing. I mean, there were other things that were building, like the misstatements of facts about law school placement and various other things.
Well, certainly that was the case, and certainly it was building, and it put our campaign in a tough position. But I think that had Joe Biden come out here, if he had the time to do it, he could get these things behind him. He's been forthright with people. He's been honest. He's been direct. That's who Joe Biden is. And I think we could have gotten a different message out, and that's one of idealism. That's one of a new sense of community. That's one that we need to get this country moving in a different direction.
He says there'll be other campaigns and he'll be there. After this, how do you think his future chances look, and how do you think people will be lining up next time around to support the candidacy, the envelope lickers, all those invisible people who work on a campaign?
I think that they will be there for him. Joe Biden is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is going to be in the national spotlight for a long time to come. He's made a lot of friends. The people of Iowa know the kind of leader that he is, and I think will be. And I think that a lot of people from Sioux City to Burlington to Des Moines to Council Bluffs are ready for the next Biden campaign.
All right, stay with us. We'll be back. Jim?
Two outside views of it now from David Gergen, former Reagan White House communications director, who is now editor of U.S. News and World Report magazine, and Democratic activist Ann Lewis, former executive director of the National Democratic Party and of the Liberal Americans for Democratic Action. David Gergen, could he have turned it around, or did he have any choice?
He had no choice. He made a very realistic decision. As a practical matter, I think the money would have dried up. He could not have run a campaign effectively in Iowa, New Hampshire, and beyond. But more than that, this was a moment when people were just beginning to examine Joe Biden. Attitudes and opinion had not crystallized about who he was. He was in the spotlight for the first time as a presidential candidate, and all the opinions that were forming about him would have been negative. His campaign would have gone into a tailspin in Iowa.
You agree?
I think he did the right thing. There comes a point, I said that maybe there's an internal rule, but after you've been the running joke on Johnny Carson so many nights in a row, it's very hard to get public attention back to the substance of what you're talking about. And I think Joe Biden was in danger of getting to that point.
You heard what Mr. Wilhelm said, that, and Mr. Martillo also, that this was kind of much ado about nothing, that what he did was really not that much of a mortal sin.
Well, it was silly. And it was so needless. I mean, to have some things like that, to trip up over this, obviously you can understand from the Biden campaign's point of view how they feel that something trivial has really sort of stolen their candidate.
But is it trivial?
But I don't think it is from the point of view of the public, from the voting public, in a year when character really is very much in the saddle, in a year when people are trying to weigh fundamentally the judgment of the candidates and how mature they are, how honest they are, how straightforward they are. I think these go to the heart of those kind of questions, and I don't think in that sense it was trivial. These were trivial. He should not have done them. They were stupid things to do. By the way, I think he is an honest man. But I think the voters have to sort of say, well, is he honest, or is he dishonest, or is he dumb? And if he's honest, then they have to conclude he's dumb, and that goes to his judgment. And I think people just are not looking for that kind of candidate in the White House.
You agree, Ann Lewis?
I'd say some of it is by, ironically, the very standards that Joe Biden set. He talked about being in a tradition of heroes. Well, those are very high standards to live up to, but that was sort of central to the theme of his campaign. Second, he talked about, and his people had talked about, one of his great resources was his ability as an orator. That was coming into question. And finally, and I agree with David, this is a year in which questions of character are being asked. More than I can remember, I'm asked about candidates, is he or she, what's he like as a person? What's she like? Can I trust them? That's very much what's on the mind, not just of voters who will focus later, but those grassroots activists who are starting to make up their minds now.
Is it just the times, the times that we sit in right now that has brought Biden down, or did he do something that most political candidates do not do, or the other ones all do it and he just get caught, David Gergen?
In general, political candidates do not do this. There is some rhetorical borrowing along the way. We do live in an age when we have tape recordings and we actually get the words down. And if you have someone who suffers, I think, from what Ed Yoder has properly called, he's a rhetorical kleptomaniac, it's a problem. It does come back to haunt you in this age. I think in a presidential election in the late 40s, if you had all these quotes, it would have doomed a candidate then. I don't think it's simply the morality of the 80s. I think it's a question some things caught up with him.
Ann Lewis, the question has been raised that is there something in the water now that causes the Joe Bidens, the political candidates, to think that they can get away with this kind of thing, or what's happening? Why have we had Gary Hart, with the issue, forget the sex part, the issue of candidness, and now we have Joe Biden caught up on essentially the same issue.
I'm sure it's not something in the water, and I honestly don't believe that Joe Biden, for whom I have great respect, especially after the last 2 weeks, thought he was getting away with something. You know, to watch him come in and chair those hearings day after day while he had this excruciating sort of agony going on the other side of his life, and still see him maintain his composure, be fair to people, give everybody their chance. That was something that deserves mark, especially today when we're talking about him in this way. So no, I don't think he was trying to sneak anything by us. I think he honestly got caught by surprise.
Okay, I missed my question.
Okay,
what I was really trying to restate actually a point that Richard Cohen made in the Washington Post this morning, that Richard Cohen was putting it on your man, President Reagan, that President Reagan has gotten away with kind of sliding around the facts, and Joe Biden and others in politics have now decided that they can do it too. And is that, you buy that?
All right, let's make
Okay.
history here. I will not blame this one on Ronald Reagan. I do think there are at least two things going on. One is on the Democratic side. We don't have a lot of issues dividing the candidates. They're really very similar in age and experience and outlook, and so questions of character, personality become more important and are getting far more scrutiny than they did before. The second, and we got into this a little bit, is the technological age. Once upon a time, when you wrote speeches or advised a candidate on issues, you said, well, now you can't say one thing in Maine and another in Georgia because the networks will pick it up. The media has nationalized the country, but we were talking about major events. We now live in a world in which everybody brings a tape recorder to the neighborhood coffee, in which colleges have the superb videotape equipment, so anything you say in an after-dinner speech or to a student audience is going to be recorded. And there is a new standard of consistency, word by word, that really hasn't existed before.
So that goes to your point, David Gergen, that stupidity is involved here.
We could blame it on fluoride. I mean, if you, but nonetheless, I do think that, I think he made a series of misjudgments. I think that he apparently suffers. All of us know him to be a very engaging man. He is an honest man. He is a man I think has made contributions in public life, but he clearly suffers from flaws in character in the way he thinks and speaks. He speaks in a sloppy way. He speaks in a way that doesn't show much self-discipline. I mean, nobody goes out and talks about their college record and what happened and how they finished in the top half of the class if they know in the back of their mind.
That's just not so. Yeah.
When it's not so, it's fundamental to who you are in your own biography as a politician. You think about those. And if you inflate all of those, it raises questions in people's minds. Well, how would he be as president? I think that's what did him in, because a lot of people are being asked to give money and being asked to line up in a candidate. And his candidacy, I think, was starting to take life in Iowa. He was starting to move.
Mr. Wilhelm, what about that there were some flaws in your candidate, that this has really just brought out?
Well, there are flaws in Joe Biden. Joe Biden's a human being. He wasn't running for sainthood. He was running for president. I mean, do we have to have candidates who decide that they're going to run for president when they're 10 years of age? That's the only way they'll live a life that's so blameless,
let me
devoid of fault.
Let me be more specific, Mr. Wilhelm. When you were riding in the car with Joe Biden and you suggested that he used the Neil Kinnock thing, were you surprised when he didn't say, no, I couldn't do that, that wouldn't be right to use that without attribution? That just happened, a few weeks ago. That didn't happen when he was a child.
Well, that's true, but in the van on the way over, I did not refer to the section of the closing as the Kinnock quote. I talked about it as the government as a platform theme. Perhaps if I'd said at the time Kinnock quote, that would have registered something in his mind, and he would have said that. It was a 2-minute close at the end of a debate, and I just think in the scheme of things, it's relatively unimportant compared to arms control agreements and the Bork nomination, and leadership in the direction of the country.
David Gergen?
Well, but the question that many people have, as a leader, you have to marshal support. You have to be credible. You have to be someone people can look up to. When you show these kinds of misjudgments, people have a hard time looking up to you, and you have a hard time being a leader. It would have crippled him, I think, in terms of his candidacy. And if he'd been president to be caught in this sort of situation, it would have been, it'd been very, very badly hurt him as a leader. He's better off, the country's better off with this decision. He made the right decision.
You think that's true, Mr. Martillo, that the country's better off and that Joe Biden, is better off for having gotten out?
Well, it's a personal decision for Joe, and I think that that's the most important test. I believe he and his family are better off, and therefore I'm happy for him. I I would accept David Gergen's characterization that some of these were silly mistakes. I think the Kennedy quote and the Humphrey quote and so forth, which happened so infrequently and without, I believe, in a very genuine way, without his knowledge, I just wish we had an ability to look at these with a little bit of greater perspective.
Meaning somebody else wrote these for him, gave them to him, and he did not realize they were Humphrey or Kennedy
and
quote.
I think that I'm convinced that that's what happened. I know I described the kind of crazed circumstances of the California speech. I don't think Joe knew he was giving a Bobby Kennedy quote, and nor do I believe he was giving a Humphrey quote. And
what about his academic record, though? David Gergen's point, a man says, hey, look, I graduated in the top half of my class, when he knows that it was
clearly a mistake, and I think he was angry that night. I mean, he was obviously reacted in anger to that particular situation. But if I might say one thing before we close this discussion, first of all, I think Joe, in a way which very few public figures have to do, has owned up to his mistakes. He's the person who supplied the law school records. Frankly, I don't think he had an absolutely clear sense of where he finished in his class, frankly. But moreover, when you look at those, I just am trying to establish the issue of perspective. And whether there was such a flagrant pattern of Joe lifting Bobby Kennedy's quotes or Hubert Humphrey's quotes, there just wasn't. Joe Biden is somebody who has written a lot of material on his own, if not most of his material, not all of it, but a great deal of it. And he has created a lot of interesting political language over the past 5 or 6, 10 years. He doesn't need to depend upon other people's ideas. But moreover, the most important point is that from a national perspective, we have a president who is talking, who did not tell the American people the truth about arms sales to Iran. And I think when you juxtapose that event and the importance to the American people of that particular issue versus these campaign incidents, I just wish we had a better chance to establish some perspective.
David Gergen, what about that?
Well, I think that it's true that the administration did not tell the truth about Iran and the Contra affair, and they paid a heavy price for it. That's the way the system works. They paid a price, and now Joe Biden's paid a price.
All right. And we have to leave it there. David Gergen, Ann Lewis, John Martella, and Mr. Wilhelm in Des Moines, thank you very much for being with us on this.